Hey guys, it's Jay Steven here, and I want to continue discussing the Northern Crusades. So, last time we talked about the beginning of the Northern Crusades, the Wendish Crusade, which was this joint campaign that took place in the context of the Second Crusade, in which the Danes and the Saxons made this attack on the pagan Wendish group. So, one thing about this first Wendish Crusade of 1147 is it really didn't achieve that much. It basically amounted to a fairly extensive raid with the backing of a papal crusade indulgence. But there wasn't a great deal of change in territory, and most crucially, of course, in the eyes of the church, the Wends were not converted. However, this initial campaign that took place in conjunction with the Second Crusade, it was basically the beginning of a much longer and more drawn-out process of wars that really took place over the course of around 4 decades, over the course of the 1140s and 1180s, in which the Wendish Slavic peoples were conquered by the Saxons and the Danes, and they were brought into the fold of Latin Christendom. So within the inception of this initial campaign in 1147 lay the seeds of a movement that was in fact going to achieve something very substantial in the history of this region, and in particular in the idea of the expansion of Latin Christendom. So, how did this happen? Well, we're going to go over that briefly because really we have to look at this if we're going to get into the continuation of the Northern Crusades, because this is the first region that had to be brought into Latin Christendom for this further expansion into the Eastern Baltic to continue. So first of all, let's ask ourselves, who were the Wends? The Wends were Slavic tribes living near the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. And this included the Abatrites, and of course that's Nyklot I's people, Nyklot being the major opponent of the Wendish Crusade of 1147, the Rugians and Pomeranians and other groups. Now, one thing about this period of time between 1147 and the mid-1180s, there were very few formal crusade bulls issued by the papacy for the campaigns in the north. So after that initial crusade bull given in 1147 for the Wendish Crusade, there just wasn't a lot of interest from the papacy in giving the Saxons and the Danes further crusade bulls at this point. Nevertheless, the drive to conquer the Wends was still very strong, and it was driven primarily by 2 people. Henry the Lion, who was the Duke of Saxony from 1142 and 1180, and Valdemar I of Denmark, or as he's known to history, Valdemar the Great, the King of Denmark from 1154 until 1182. So, who were these guys? Henry the Lion and Valdemar the Great were very dynamic and interesting figures, so I think it's worth taking a look at each of them individually. So, Henry the Lion, he was one of the most powerful and energetic of the German princes of his day. He was a member of the Welf dynasty, and he was Duke of Saxony, also Duke of Bavaria. He came into conflict with the German Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, and eventually the Hohenstaufen dynasty was able to force him out of power. Nevertheless, at the height of his power, he ruled an incredibly large stretch of territory, which reached from the coast of the North and Baltic Seas to the Alps, and from Westphalia to Pomerania. And he was very interested in this project of conquering and converting Slavic territory. Valdemar I of Denmark, who reigned from 1154 until 1182, he's known to history as Valdemar the Great because under him, the Kingdom of Denmark really came to its heights and began to rise as a serious power, and in fact reached its zenith under his second son and successor, Valdemar II. Now, although the Danes and the Saxons had been allies in the Wendish Crusade, that didn't mean that this alliance was immune to other political concerns. So, for example, in the immediate aftermath of the Wendish Crusade, the 1147 into the early 1150s, there was a truce between the Duchy of Saxony and the Wends under Prince Nyklot I. And in fact, Wendish pirates were allowed to plunder Danish coasts without intervention from the Saxons. The Saxons basically looked the other way. And in fact, the Saxons even profited from this because the Wends were paying them tribute. So some of that plundered Christian wealth was finding its way back into the pockets of the Saxon lords. However, eventually, Prince Nyklot's piracy got out of hand, and he began to push harder against his Christian enemies. As you remember from the last podcast, Nyklot was very much a defiant pagan. He was committed to the old ways, and unlike some Slavic princes who were more willing to compromise on these issues, he was very defiant. So this ultimately pushed the Danes and Saxons back into an alliance with each other, and a joint campaign between Henry the Lion and King Valdemar I of Denmark was organized in 1160. Now, the formula for a lot of these Danish and Saxon alliances in terms of their actual attacks on Slavic territory often was consistent. And just like in the Wendish Crusade, in this crusade, the Danes acted as a navy, basically. So Valdemar raided the Wendish coast and basically attacked from sea. Meanwhile, Henry, with his heavy cavalry of Saxon knights, ravaged deep into the Wendish hinterland. And this campaign was quite a bit more successful than that initial Wendish Crusade of 1147. In fact, Prince Nyklot himself was slain in battle. And you can see here the artwork that is showing right now is actually an image of the death of Nyklot. Essentially, the land of the Abatrites, so that is the Slavic group that was under Prince Nyklot, was partitioned between the allies. So this was quite a bit more successful than the previous campaign. Now, during the 1160s, there was a Wendish revolt, and the conquering Christian forces were driven out of a lot of their Wendish conquests. And during this period, Valdemar and Henry sat down and agreed to a partition of future conquests of Wendish territory. Now, this is very interesting because to me, this parallels another front of crusading, and that is Spain. We can think about how in the Iberian Christian kingdoms, you often had this, where the kings would agree to a future partition of Moorish land. For example, the kings of Castile and Leon agreed with the king of Aragon on a partition of future conquests, a sort of a zone of conquest for each king. And this is kind of what Valdemar and Henry were doing, although as we're going to see here, it didn't really hold up very well. What happened was, in the late 1160s, the Danes under Valdemar affected this very total conquest of the Rugians. And this campaign was so successful, a huge amount of plunder was taken, the territory was conquered, and the Rugian temples were destroyed. And Henry wanted half of what Valdemar had conquered. And so there was fighting between the Danes and the Saxons over this issue. However, the papacy was beginning once again to take notice of these campaigns in the north. And in fact, the Danish conquest of the Rugians was so impressive to the papacy that Pope Alexander III issued a statement on it. This is something that Pope Alexander III wrote to Bishop Absalon, a Danish bishop, in November of 1169 about his joy at the conquests of King Valdemar. Inspired with the heavenly flame, strengthened by the arms of Christ, armed with the shield of faith, and protected by divine favor, has defeated those hard-hearted men by the might of his valiant arm, and has strenuously recalled them from their most scandalous enormities to the faith and the law of Christ, and he has also subjected them to his dominion. So once again, the popes were becoming interested in the north as a front for crusade. And in fact, in 1171, Pope Alexander issued a bull called Non Parum Animus Noster, in which he defined the Northern Crusades as equal to the Crusade in the Holy Land. And this was far more of a general declaration on these campaigns rather than just focusing on one specific crusade, as had happened in the Wendish Crusade of 1147. So Eric Christensen, in his book The Northern Crusades, includes this quote from Pope Alexander from the bull. We therefore grant to those who fight with might and courage against the aforesaid pagans 1 year's remission for the sins they confess and receive penance for, trusting in God's mercy and the merits of the apostles Peter and Paul, just as we usually grant to those who visit the sepulchre of the Lord. And if those who perish in the fight are doing their penance, to them we grant remission of all their sins. So this is very substantial, coming from the papacy. The final joint campaign between Henry the Lion and Valdemar I of Denmark was in 1177, in which they defeated the Pomeranians. Now, the downfall of Henry the Lion in 1180, in which he was removed from power by Frederick Barbarossa, pretty much left the push against the Slavs in the hands of the Danes. And this also led to a change in tactics on the part of the Danes. So previously, in these joint Saxon-Danish campaigns, there was this process by which the Kingdom of Denmark attacked from the sea using their navy, while the Saxon knights would attack inland. So the land force was the Saxons, the Danes were the sea force. But in this case, Valdemar began to almost revive Viking techniques, the use of these Viking ships, the Snecka. And what they did were these swift marine raids, often employing rivers to cut deep into Wendish territory and to burn and plunder and devastate crops and cause incredible destruction and take captives and all that stuff. Okay, now this was not that new. Like in the past, raiding had gone back and forth between the Danes and the Wends. But there was a new situation. Denmark was now better protected. Part of Valdemar's efforts to bolster his kingdom, he had established new fortifications and new coastal castles, which were very strong. Stone fortifications, which were very effective at countering piracy from the Wends. So, or raids from the Wends via ship. So this introduces a serious problem for the Wends. They are indeed defeated in an engagement in 1072, and this is the end, pretty much, of Wendish raids on Denmark. And so at this point, the Danes are pretty much able to ravage the Wends without much pushback at all. So the Kingdom of Denmark is really going to come to dominate this region. Now, one thing that takes place over the course of this process is the conversion of Slavic princes. So as this process is taking place, as the Saxons and Danes are pushing into Wendish territory, the Wends are not one single group. There are different Wendish tribal groups, and sometimes they were pitted against each other. Well, certain Slavic chieftains begin to convert. Perhaps they read the writing on the wall. I mean, now instead of becoming a target for Danish raids, they now can become vassals to the Danes, and indeed can become allies in attacking their fellow Slavs. And so as this happens, as you begin to have Slavic princes converting and cooperating with the Danes, Danish monasteries and abbeys are established in Wendish lands. And so we now have monks coming in to Wendish territory, and they are beginning to set up monasteries. This is going to impact the local populations. There's education of the local populations. This really kind of jumpstarts and puts into high gear the conversion of the Wendish people. And there are a lot of newly converted Wendish chieftains who are very willing to take part in this. So it's almost kind of a cooperative effort between newly Christianized Wends and their entourages and the Danish clergy. And indeed, early on in these Wendish Crusades, if we want to refer to this whole period, the 1140s through the 1180s, as an ongoing Wendish Crusade, early on in this period, the Saxons tried to displace the local Slavic nobility, or chieftains, if you will. But this proved far more difficult than just converting them. And often, this was a more effective way to maintain control and maintain conquests. Because if you have local nobility and local, warrior chieftains converting to Christianity and becoming allies to the Saxons and the Danes, well, that's a far easier thing than expelling and replacing them. And this had a great deal to do with the conversion of the Wendish people there along the southern Baltic. So, by the mid-1180s, the Wendish wars are pretty much over. And at this point, both the victors and the converted, the victors and the conquered, are now looking toward the further east Baltic for new crusades. And indeed, the papacy in the last, as we get into the 13th century, is going to become even more interested in the Northern Crusades. And it's quite interesting that a lot of these Slavic peoples who were conquered by this initial Northern Crusade are going to participate, along with Germans and other groups, in the conquest of these various Finnish and Baltic peoples. Some of the upcoming crusades are going to be the crusades against the Livonians, the Estonians, the Prussians, but all of that was made possible by this initial conversion of the Wends, these people occupying space along the southern Baltic. As Eric Christensen puts it in his book, The Northern Crusades, this furthering campaign against East Baltic heathendom. So yeah, the Northern Crusades are going to press on, and I'm going to be talking about them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this second installment in my discussion of the Northern Crusades, the continuing Wendish Crusade. I'd like to take a moment to say thanks to my latest Patreon supporter, Paul Jarvis, who signed up for $5 a month. And if you guys like what Real Crusades History does, if you sign up to support us on Patreon, $5 monthly gets you access to a lot of bonus material, as well as our entire back catalog of podcasts. That's a folder that I send to all of my Patreon supporters there. So sign up there. You can find the link down below. Also, be sure to check out my novel of the Crusades, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, which takes place in the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. And check out my CD, Scatheless, featuring the song Templar. So I'll talk to you guys later.